This will sound very strange, but on July 31st, 2019, a Navy pilot flew his fighter jet into the wall of what is known as Star Wars Canyon. Fighter pilots drop their jets in between the walls of the canyon, which resembles the climax of the movie Star Wars when Luke Skywalker drops into the corridor canyon of the Death Star before they blow the Death Star up in an epic explosion. This Star Wars Canyon in California is in Death Valley National Park, which hints at the Death Star. His name happened to be Charles Walker, which hinted at Luke Skywalker. And this is an amazing prophecy that is not only predicting the date that Kamala Harris will die in a plane crash due to a bird strike on November 3rd, on June 30th, that is predicting that a dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan on April 13th, 2023. And there will be a massive evacuation of Manhattan Island. It is also likely that the official narrative in the mainstream media that will emerge regarding this event will somehow be a lie. The date that this video is posted proves that this prediction was made ahead of time, as does this timestamped email and forensic notes PDF. If you are skeptical, please email me and I will forward these to you. As you can see in this email, this prediction was known since at least February 22nd. I'm going to begin here with describing the amazing sign that occurred on July 31st, 2019, this crash of this FA-18 fighter jet into Star Wars Canyon. And to begin, I'm just going to read the beginning of an article in the New York Times, just to begin describing this. Fighter jets on training missions drop into a narrow canyon in California's Death Valley National Park, banking and dodging the jagged walls. On a nearby overlook, tourists and aviation enthusiasts crane their necks or aim cameras at the jets, some of them so close that onlookers can glimpse into cockpits. This is a typical day at the so-called Star Wars Canyon, where the high-tech spectacle of American military jets resembles the famous sequence in Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, in which spaceships plunge and speed through a corridor on the Death Star. But on Wednesday, a Navy FA-18 Super Hornet crashed near the canyon, killing the pilot, military officials said. On Friday, the Navy identified the pilot as Lieutenant Charles Z. Walker, 33 years old. 7 people on the ground were injured, none of them seriously, said Patrick Taylor, a National Park Service spokesman. The plane went down just before 10 a.m. about 40 miles north of Naval Air Weapons Station, China Lake, the Navy said, and it left a dark scorch mark seared onto the volcanic cinder surface of the valley. The cause of the crash is being investigated. Park rangers responded to the scene after they received reports of smoke. The people who were injured told them that they had been hit by fragments of the crash and had cuts or burns, Mr. Taylor said. They were taken to nearby medical facilities and treated, he said. The people who were hurt were a part of a tour group from France, the news station ABC7 reported. One of them, his leg bandaged, told the news channel that the plane had crashed about 160 feet in front of their group, which had been overlooking the valley. So regarding the tourists, this is in fact, for aviation enthusiasts, one of the meccas of traveling from around the world. People come to see the jets fly through Star Wars Canyon. And from the top of the canyon, from the vantage point, you can actually look down into the cockpits of the fighter pilots because they're flying through the Star Wars Canyon. Now, as I mentioned, the pilot that crashed, his name was Charles Walker. And we're talking about Star Wars Canyon. And this is uncanny, and of course it hints at Luke Skywalker. As was mentioned in the article, the pilot was from the Naval Air Weapons Station in China Lake near the south end of Death Valley National Park. And this location was in the news just 27 days earlier for being the location of the strongest earthquake in California in 20 years. This was the Ridgecrest California earthquake. And although the media reported it was the strongest earthquake in 20 years, what they didn't realize is that it was literally exactly 20 biblical years. Biblical years are 360-day years. And in the Bible, a 20-year period is a very prophetic and symbolic period. It symbolizes a complete period of waiting. The earthquake before that was the Joshua Tree, California earthquake in 1999, an extremely prophetic earthquake. But the reason for going into that is because this Death Canyon National Park sign, Star Wars Canyon crash, was 27 days, which is 3 sets of 9 days. And the Star Wars Canyon crash is part of an amazing set of 9 signs that occurred at 9-day intervals that all connected with each other, that began with Pentecost in June of 2019. That was the Jericho earthquake, followed by the Manhattan earthquake, and then followed by the Ridgecrest earthquake that I just mentioned, followed by the Manhattan blackout at the same time as the 4.0 magnitude earthquake in Manhattan, Montana, that occurred 9 months and 11 days after the swarm of earthquakes began there. And then after that was the Joshua Tree National Park earthquake that was 9.9 miles south of 29 Palms, which hinted at Psalm 29, in which says that the voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. This was a national park, and it was also on the same day that the 9-year-old girl was tossed by the bison into the air right next to Old Faithful Geyser in Yellowstone National Park, another wilderness. And this was the year that Yellowstone, or Old Faithful Geyser, had been experiencing its record year for eruptions. And so all of this was hinting at the coming eruption of Yellowstone. And also on that day was the biblical floods in Manhattan. And 9 days after the 9-year-old girl was tossed into the air was this day that Charles Walker crashed into the wall of the Rainbow Canyon. Well, actually, the nickname is Star Wars Canyon. The actual name for it in the national park is called Rainbow Canyon, which I guess is a good segue now to the next point. It's because this is ultimately pointing to the rainbow president, Barack Obama, who famously lit up the White House in rainbow colors on the 9th of Tammuz in the Hebrew calendar in 2015, on the day the Supreme Court voted in favor of legalizing gay marriage. And the walls of security were breached. The pilot crashed into the wall of the canyon. Well, the walls of the security of Jerusalem were breached by the Babylonians on the 9th of Tammuz, and then the Romans in 70 AD on the 17th of Tammuz. And so these two dates are commemorated still to this day for Jews. The 9th and 17th of Tammuz, in the Bible, walls of security collapsing symbolize God's judgment. And God's sign regarding judgment, the rainbow, is described in the last verse of the account of Noah's flood, Genesis 9:17. And this hints at the president that was president from 2009 until 2017. And speaking of rainbow, after the president lit up the White House in rainbow colors, it was exactly 110 weeks to the day of the stunning double rainbow over the White House that Trump tweeted about in August of 2017. And as explained in other videos, God pairs the numbers 9 and 110 together. And so this 110 weeks connection in between these two rainbow signs connected with the 9th of Tammuz, which also connected with other 9s that are explained in other videos. But that's a pairing of 9 and 110. And the reason why God does those pairings is to confirm the signs and connections. And so also the rainbow president wasn't only president from 2009 until 2017. He arrived in Washington, D.C. as the senator from Illinois, as in the 109th Congress, studied at Columbia University while living on 109th Street in Manhattan, and will return to the District of Columbia as the president again in the 117th Congress, which began in January of 2021. But anyway, the reason for going into that is because it's necessary to demonstrate the connection to Barack Obama, the 44th president, that is being pointed to through the Star Wars Canyon crash. Now, the Star Wars Canyon crash was a crash that pointed to the movie Star Wars, of course, with the climax of the movie when Luke Skywalker and the others from the rebellion are flying into the corridor, the tight corridor at high speed on the Death Star, which is why the canyon is nicknamed Star Wars Canyon, and why this occurred in Death Valley National Park. This Star Wars Canyon is in Death Valley National Park, which of course also hints at the Death Star. And in the climax of the movie Star Wars, the Death Star is destroyed with an epic explosion, which is why this sign is involved in this trail of signs that is leading to the epic explosion in Manhattan on August 21st. Death Valley National Park is a national park, which gives this prophetic sign national judgment symbolism. And again, it is part of a trail of signs of 9 signs at 9-day intervals that was 9 days after the prophetic earthquake in Joshua Tree National Park, 9.9 miles south of 29 Palms, and on the same day as the 9-year-old girl was tossed into the air in Yellowstone National Park. Well, as was mentioned in the New York Times article, that episode of Star Wars, which was the first Star Wars movie, but it was named Episode 4. So, and Episode 4, the climactic moment of it is when the Death Star explodes. And as I'm going to explain, this Death Star canyon crash was an explosion into the wall of the canyon, which ended up spraying debris onto the tourists, 7 of them, by the way, which is God's number, that his signature number that indicates his divine touch upon something. And that was an explosion. And as I will explain, this sign is leading to the upcoming explosion, predicted explosion in Manhattan. And so the Death Star exploded at the end of the movie, and then that was basically the end of the movie. The enemy was defeated. And so, but that was Episode 4, and the rainbow the rainbow, by the way, is God's sign regarding judgment described in Genesis chapter 9. But, so that was Episode 4, and from the Episode 4 sign, the Star Wars Canyon crash, it is 444 days to this date here, October 17th, 2020, which was a date that was predicted ahead of time and documented in videos that there would be an explosion on this date. And this was one of a number of signs that were pointing, that God was using to point to this date ahead of time. That included Star Wars and Harrison Ford signs. And that's how I knew that there would be an explosion. And it was largely due to the connections to the Star Wars and Harrison Ford signs. And then lo and behold, on that day, a national news story was the explosion in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Now, there's a lot to that sign. I don't think I should get off onto the tangent and explain it into too much detail, because it would require bringing in the Boston Marathon, which was an explosion that killed 3 people. But the explosion in this Harrisonburg explosion injured 3 people at the finish line of a marathon, just like the Boston Marathon killed 3 people at the finish line of the marathon. And there's more to that, but it's explained in other videos. But God pairs the numbers 44 and 23 together. And that's what we have right here with this 444 days, hinting at the 44th president. And the reason why he pairs numbers together, first of all, is that's how God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections works. It works on the principle of second and third and multiple witnesses confirming a matter, as the Bible says is required, which is what makes it true and not a product of one's imagination and different and unique from other things. And it's what proves that his true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections is only being explained on this channel. But if you think about it, that's how he would do it. He would pair numbers together. And that's what he does. But that's, rather than just one number by itself, which could theoretically, although you could have other second witnesses for the number, but pairing the numbers together are in itself a second witness, right? And that's why he pairs 44 and 23 together. It's because he's pointing to the 44th president, the basketball president that wore jersey number 23 when he played basketball in high school. In fact, that jersey is, I believe, it's the highest selling high school basketball jersey, more than LeBron James's high school basketball jersey. But anyway, 23 weeks and 50 weeks, what we have right here, God uses these numbers of weeks frequently because they both symbolize the church. Well, 23 weeks is obviously, the one reason being is because he's pointing to the basketball president that wore jersey 23. But also 23 weeks and 50 weeks because they both symbolize the church, and the main theme of God's big picture of end times judgment warning signs is in fact judgment on the church, judgment warning for the church. Because as Peter said, judgment begins with the church. And there's so much to be said. God is not pleased with the church, especially the American church. God reproves whom he loves. He's not pleased with the American evangelical church. But the reason for 50 and 23, well, the Feast of Pentecost symbolizes the church, and it's also known as the Feast of Weeks. And Pentecost literally means 50 days, and that's why 50 weeks, connections. The reason for 23 weeks is because the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, is described in Leviticus chapter 23. All right, now, what makes this relevant? Not only are they paired together, but in the center of this connection, we have a church judgment warning sign, which was the church bombing by the suicide terrorists in Indonesia. And I'm not going to explain it here. It's explained in other videos, but God uses the country of Indonesia to point to Barack Obama and Isaiah chapter 34. And Indonesia is made up of 34 provinces, which is the judgment on the nations chapter of the Bible. And anyway, the 44th president grew up in Indonesia for 4 years. And that's one reason why Indonesia is used. And that's why it's used here, because the Antichrist, the 44th president, will persecute the church. And so that's why other things happened on this day, this Passover. It was the day of the epic flooding in Nashville, the second wettest 2-day period. And also the Satan shoes controversy erupted on that day, which is also pointing at the basketball president. These are basketball shoes, and on the side of it is it's literally on the side of the shoe is Luke 10:18, and that's when Jesus said he saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven, and that's what Barack Obama's name means in Hebrew. Barack means lightning, Obama means heaven, and O, the language Jesus would have spoken, Aramaic, means from. Barack Obama, lightning from heaven. But that's explained better in other videos. But from 50 weeks after this church bombing gets us to the explosion or the bombing predicted to be coming on April 13th in Manhattan. This video was originally produced before March 13th, 2022. God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections was overwhelmingly pointing to March 13th, 2022 as being extremely important in the trail of signs that are leading to the day that a dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan. Given this knowledge regarding March 13th, 2022, it was therefore assumed that March 13th would be the day of this dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan. Instead, March 13th ended up being a major important step in the trail of signs that is leading to the day of the predicted dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan. Another amazing date of signs related to the dirty bomb explosion in New York City, and a step in the trail of signs that is leading to the day it is predicted that the dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan on April 13th. This trail of signs that begins with March 13th. I have a number of videos that are on this channel that lead a trail to March 13th. And then the trail, I should say trails plural, is so amazing and profound going forward from this March 13th date. And it required another video in itself because it's another hour, and it's a very, very worthwhile hour. In fact, it's a must, obviously, once the prediction comes to pass. All of the videos are a must watch, obviously, but this is the highlight one, if you will. Again, the trails are leading to March 13th, and then this explains the more recent signs that occurred, and a bigger picture context as well that goes back many years. So anyway, the point is you need to watch the follow-up video, which I have titled, which could have been any number of different titles, because of course the information is made up of many different signs, but the title of this I think is very appropriate because of one particular sign, which is that Obama's return to the White House for the first time for the anniversary of his nationalized health care in April of 2022. This is the title. The title of the video that you must watch now is Prediction: Obama's Return to the White House equals Dirty Bomb Explosion in New York City on April 13th. In the description box below this video that you are watching, I will leave a link to this other video. All right, now at the top of the diagram here, we have this 110 weeks connection. I just mentioned a 110 weeks connection. Here is another one. 110 weeks are especially prophetic because, well, they are 110 days times 7. And in the book of Joshua, Joshua led the Hebrews around the walls of security of the ancient city of Jericho 7 times over 7 days, while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets before the walls of security collapsed in judgment. Joshua died at the age of 110. And so we have this 3 sets of 7 in the book of Joshua, which, by the way, also parallels a 3 sets of 7 judgments in the book of Revelation. And so we have these 7s, and Joshua died at the 110. So 110 days times 7 is even more prophetic than simply 110 days, which are also prophetic. But they blew trumpets before the walls of security collapsed in judgment, and that's why this connection here is relevant. One reason is that it's exactly 110 weeks to the Feast of Trumpets on September 7th, 2021. Now, the walls of security collapsed in Jericho due to an earthquake, and that's exactly what happened on this day. It was a 7.0 earthquake, which confirmed the 110 weeks connection because of the Joshua symbolism. We have a 7 in the earthquake. It's a 7.0 earthquake. And that occurred immediately following, it occurred in Mexico, and it immediately followed the Supreme Court of Mexico's ruling on legalizing abortion. And President Trump's presidency was synonymous with his border wall of security. Even his election campaign, how he trumpeted his way to the White House, was all about the border wall of security, which was symbolism, which was Joshua symbolism, because of the walls of security collapsed after the trumpets were blown. In fact, the entire presidency of Trump is symbolized as symbolism for the trumpeting of the trumpet before America's walls of security collapse. This is what the southern border wall of security symbolizes, which is not why it's no coincidence that after left the White House, there has been an inundation, a major breach of the wall of security. The earthquake on the other side of the wall in Mexico, God uses Mexico earthquakes as symbolism for Joshua's symbolism. They are symbolizing the earthquake that fell the walls of the ancient city of Jericho. And for those that are saying to themselves, well, the Bible doesn't say the walls fell due to an earthquake. Well, it doesn't actually say that, but archaeology says that. And of course, it makes sense that that's how the walls would have fallen. And by the way, in archaic English, the word trump means trumpet or the sounding of a trumpet, which is why he chose his running mate Mike Pence. Trump Pence hints at trumpets. Now, the other very important sign that occurred on this date was the theft of grapes from the vineyard in the middle of the night, from a vineyard in Liberty, Missouri. This is a judgment warning for the church because the thief comes in the night to rapture God's people. That's the symbolism of the theft of the grapes in the middle of the night. It was the news stories. It was a national news story. The news stories talk about it being $2,000 worth of grapes. It was to supply a local church. Oh, if I didn't mention it, the vineyard was owned by a church. That's why it's so profound that this sign occurred on the Feast of Trumpets, because the Feast of Trumpets symbolizes the rapture, which will be the moment of the last trump described in Bible prophecy. But this is actually a judgment warning for the church because, let's just say, a lot of Christians aren't going to make the rapture. Let's just put it that way. But that's why liberty and this theft of grapes, and also it wasn't the only theft of grapes in the middle of the night that was a judgment sign, warning for the church. There was also another one in 2018 in Virginia, which hints at the virgins in the parable of the virgins, which, contrary to those with the Nicolaitan doctrine of our day, Calvinism and free grace, and all Christians will be raptured, the 5 virgins that are left behind in this parable symbolize the church that is going to be left behind. And make no mistake, the reason why God has given me a voice through this prediction is to prove the things that I just said. And also the virgin in the Revelation chapter 12 sign as well. The rapture sign recorded in Revelation chapter 12 that was fulfilled in the night sky in 2017. But that's also what's being symbolized here, because in the story of Jericho is also symbolism for taking the promised land, and it is symbolism for the raptured church, because out of Jericho, Rahab was rescued, Rahab and her family, which symbolizes the Gentile church that will be liberated from the ruler of this world, Satan. Now, God uses 188 days connections to symbolize H188, which is the word for woe, exclamation mark, extreme judgment, used in context of extreme judgment in the Bible, and it's explained more 188 in other videos. But it is 188 days from this extremely prophetic serious sign here to the day of this serious sign here, which is the prediction for this explosion in Manhattan. Things will obviously change after this. By the way, the reason why it won't just be a bombing, I believe the signs indicate it'll be a dirty bombing. I don't think it will be a nuclear bomb, but that's also a possibility. But okay, I mentioned earlier that God pairs the numbers 9 and 110 together. Well, it is exactly 9 months from this extremely prophetic date and these signs to June 7th, the day of the amazing Kamala Harris related prophetic signs that are part of the trail of signs that are leading to her death on November 3rd. But this trail that picks up on June 7th and the signs that occurred on June 7th will be explained in the Kamala Harris videos. And all of this will symbolize Satan falling like lightning from heaven. She will be replaced by the Antichrist after she falls from the sky in her plane crash. And there will be an explosion involved with that. And that's why this ultimately connects back to the Star Wars crash explosion into the wall of the canyon. By the way, that wall of the canyon is also a confirmation, a second witness to the 110 weeks connection to this earthquake. Because of, again, 110 symbolizes Joshua and the walls of security collapsing on Jericho, which archaeology proves collapsed due to an earthquake. In other words, this diagram you're looking at here is truly astounding. And by the way, all of these dates were known ahead of time. Every single one of them, I knew to expect a major prophetic sign. In this case, I knew it would be an explosion, and then it was. Of course, I was expecting stuff because not only was it the Feast of Trumpets, that's simple, of course, but there was a ton of confirmation that God was using ahead of time to point to this date. It was amazing. And likewise, this date here, and one of them being this 23 weeks connection, I knew that ahead of time, and I expected an explosion, and then there was the church bombing. I didn't actually learn about this till a few weeks later, when I was doing more research. There were other signs that occurred on the date that I recognized right away, of course. And again, my point is that this was known ahead of time because it was 23 weeks. I knew that there would be an explosion on this date, and because it was 23 weeks from this explosion. And so we can expect something very big here. And this diagram is extremely prophetic. Make sure you share this with every single person you know. And when this prediction comes to pass, you will know that you need to watch every single minute of every video on this channel. God bless. Aliens and UFOs are demons masquerading as aliens and UFOs. Most people's spiritual experiences are demonic deception, especially if they are not a true follower of Christ. Jesus died for you. It is time to repent, which means to change one's ways and turn to God and become a disciple of Jesus. Please leave a like and upvote the video. And once this prediction has come to pass, share this video with everyone you know, and more. Don't stop sharing it everywhere in social media. It is essential that everyone immediately read the homepage of my website, TrumpPrediction.com.